Welcome to the Full Frame Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Walter. The relationship between China and the United States remains one of the most consequential in the world on issues of trade, technology, and geopolitical influence. What is the potential for cooperation and growth? AI is transforming economic opportunities in Silicon Valley, and the region's high-tech ecosystem is increasingly intertwined with China's AI development. Our guest is Sean Randolph, Senior Director of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute, which examines how economic policy shapes both the Bay Area and California. This episode is called Rethinking China-U.S. Relations.
Full Frame.
Let me ask about the relationship between California and China.
Sure.
How would you describe that?
I would describe it as positive and longstanding. The first Chinese immigrants to the United States immigrated through the Golden Gate before there was a bridge in the mid-1800s. We've had the largest Chinese community in the United States ever since then, especially linking us with southern China, with Guangdong province. We've been the recipients more recently of just tons of Chinese students coming into our universities. So there's a lot of cultural history, of cultural intelligence, of family connection between here and China that really, I think, exceeds anywhere else in the United States. So that's bedrock. We also have a pretty close alignment on economic issues, economic trade, especially there's been a huge flow between here and China. It's been affected, of course, by what's going on politically these days. That's unavoidable. But I think the foundation, the economic, the cultural, the family foundation between here and China is very, very strong.
It's interesting, if California was its own country, it'd be a huge economy. But because of that, the fact that it's such a huge economy, clearly it has to be buffeted, impacted by what's going on geopolitically. And I think obviously about ports, LA, tariffs, supply chains, all of that sort of thing. So can you talk just from a global standpoint, how all of these kind of levers that are being pulled impact the state of California?
Well, trade is a big topic, of course. And so is foreign investment. I think we've seen trade with China declining, as it is with the U.S. generally, under the pressure of tariffs. But this trade flows are still very strong. They're not going away. We've seen in the last few years the amount of investment coming here from China going down. I think 2016-17 was the peak. And the amount of new greenfield investment from here going into China is also down almost entirely for geopolitical reasons. There's a lot of reinvestment by our companies that are now in China, reinvesting in their presence in China. And we still have a lot of China-related activity here, but certainly the uncertainty and instability in the tariff environment has been very, very challenging for our ports, for our people doing customs broking, obviously for our importers needing to decide how much of the added cost of tariffs do they absorb. So I think a lot of it is the uncertainty we've had in the tariff and the trade environment that has made business decisions very difficult for a lot of our companies. Now, hopefully that settles out a little bit more. We have a little bit more clarity since Presidents Trump and Xi met, but it's still a pretty uncertain landscape.
Speaking of Trump and Xi meeting, there's a lot of talk about Trump going to China. I mean, what are the expectations? What are the hopes for people here in California?
Well, I think when we look at their last meeting together in Korea, that was a fix. It wasn't a restructuring. It was, let's step back and introduce some stability into this, at least for the coming year. I don't think expectations are very high for anything new or dramatic or any big structural change in the relationship. I think a lot of people are hoping that we will have something coming out that assures some continuing level of predictability and stability. Because one thing businesses hate, they hate uncertainty, they hate instability. If they know the game, they can respond to it. If they don't know the rules, they don't know what to do, and then they don't invest. And so I think what people are looking for at the least is signs of continuing stability and agreement for a baseline of relations between here and China so that business can proceed.
Let me ask about the San Francisco Bay Area and China's Bay Area,
Right.
the relationship there. How would you describe it?
I think it's very promising. So we're a big economic region here. China Greater Bay Area is also a really big economic region. Our organization, the Bay Area Council, has had a dialogue with the China Greater Bay Area, with governmental entities, think tanks, businesses, going back to when the idea in China was first launched. And so there's a natural synergy, a natural basis for conversation and exchange between the San Francisco Bay Area and the China Greater Bay Area because we have similar assets. We here are probably the world's #1 technology and innovation and entrepreneurial center. You have really strong technology in Shenzhen. You have more and more science. Shenzhen is, of course, a national magnet for entrepreneurs in China. There is a huge market in the Greater Bay Area. We have a lot of historical ties with Hong Kong that can play a pretty important intermediary role for our companies that are engaging in the Greater Bay Area. So, in the background, there's all kinds of issues. The national conversation between the U.S. government and the Chinese government make it complicated about what you can do realistically. There's some things that are just harder to do than they were 5 or 10 years ago. But nevertheless, the connections are very much there. And I think it's a natural conversation between our Bay Area and China's. The big difference is actually that aside from China's being much bigger geographically, much bigger population, I think we're more intensely focused on the technology and innovation side. But China's does a lot more manufacturing. We don't do a whole lot of manufacturing here anymore in the Bay Area, San Francisco. We do a lot of prototyping, a lot of early stage stuff, but at scale, supplier networks, that's much more in China. So I think we're going to have, one way or the other, a long-term relationship when it comes to supply chain, supplier networks, and just how the China fits into our global patterns here.
One of the guests I spoke to said that in China there are hundreds of Mark Zuckerbergs. They're just everywhere, with all these young entrepreneurs, and I've met some of them, and I tended to agree with her. These guys, they're forward thinking, they're bouncing all these ideas off of each other, and that's kind of what the Silicon Valley's been too.
Very much,
manufacturing that. You talk about not manufacturing, that's been manufactured. Which gets to the whole idea of collaboration, but then competition and complexities. Can you talk about how do you differentiate between all the different C's?
It's really complicated, and it's more complicated than it was in the past. We used to, the Bay Area Council, be very active when we opened our first China offices more than 15 years ago, helping companies from here go into China, get their feet on the ground in the China market. It's a more complicated story now. So we've shifted. We do that. We actually set up a California pavilion every year in Shanghai at the CIIE, the big Shanghai International Import Expo. So we're very committed to that and keeping those channels open. We are still introducing companies from here into China and into the China market. I think we see a real opportunity at the entrepreneurial level. This is the biggest pool of entrepreneurs in the world here in the Bay Area. And we're very familiar with the entrepreneurial environment in China, and there's just a lot of aggressiveness and hard work and creative people. And so there's a lot of respect for what's coming out of China that gets reflected in a lot of technologies, reflected in AI in China, reflected in robotics, reflected in batteries. So I think it's important for us to stay close to and engage with China on these emerging leading edge technologies, on innovation in some of these key fields, because between us and China, that's going to probably set the tune for the rest of the world. and where that opens up opportunities where we're able to collaborate, develop markets together. It's something we want to do. And, it's difficult in some fields. There are barriers in semiconductors and barriers in AI, but things around renewable energy, things around climate where we have shared interests, certainly things around health. What about cancer? Cancer rates are rising in China as populations get older, industrial pollution, all of those things. We have high cancer rates here. You could talk about Alzheimer's. You could talk about a lot of health-related products and therapies where we should be able to develop these together and manage those relationships effectively. So despite, the fact that there are more obstacles on the field than there used to be, I think there's still a lot of relatively open doors we need to push on.
You mentioned AI. What about AI regulations? There's been so much discussion about that, and it doesn't seem like anybody's kind of landing one way or the other, and it seems like it's the wild, wild west, and everybody has a different idea. I mean, what are you hearing out there about that, and what are your thoughts?
It's a really good question because you have all these issues and potentialities around the investment in AI and about deployment, large language models, small language models, applications, the hardware, the whole thing. 75% of all the investment in the United States going into AI is going into AI companies in San Francisco and Silicon Valley, primarily San Francisco. More than half of the leading generative AI companies in the world are located here around San Francisco. You could walk to them in 25 or 30 minutes. I think there's a recognition that we need guardrails of some kind. We need reference points of some kind that this can be deployed safely and not be misused. At the same time, philosophically, we don't in California want to get in the way of innovation. We don't want to start by crafting huge regulatory frameworks that inhibit the ability of companies here to grow as quickly as they possibly can because it's driving so much of the economy now.
Let me ask one final question, which gets to what you were just talking about, different perspectives, Europe and here. I often see the description of U.S.-China relations as this race to the future, and they're kind of neck and neck. But listening to you talking about cancer, why can't it be a race together to solve the problems?
Yeah.
And so that gets back to collaboration and this whole kind of collaboration competition. What needs to take place? I mean, what would you like to see happen to create more collaboration between the United States and China? And is it possible, or is there always going to be this tension, you think?
Well, I hope there's not always this tension. We know there are issues. We know there are barriers, no question, but let's not stop there. Let's look for where the opportunities are to proceed together. And so we could have a conversation around what are the appropriate guidelines, guardrails for AI? Don't have to be doing AI research together. Internationally, what are the right kind of guardrails we should all be looking for? We see climate as being an area for cooperation for sure. I think I mentioned health. All kinds of issues around health and medicine we could be addressing. And another one broadly is science, that there is a U.S.-China science agreement that was renewed about a year ago at the end of the Biden administration. It needs to be implemented. I think there's an opportunity to enact, to implement, to move forward the science agreement we have in place to do some new things that help all of our citizens and maybe citizens around the world. And then finally, it's not a popular thing with our government in D.C. now, but I think we've all benefited from having students going back and forth. There are so many fewer American students in China than there used to be. We ought to have a lot more students there. And even though, entry is more difficult than it once was, I think we should be setting a goal, whatever the guidelines are, with having as many Chinese students here as possible, because there's a legacy that comes from living with each other and getting to know each other.
People-to-people exchanges.
People to people, you bet.
Thank you so much.
Happy to, of course.
That was my conversation with Sean Randolph of the Bay Area Council Economic Institute for this episode of the Full Frame Podcast. Special thanks to my colleagues, Jolie Lee, and Jan Shuryanan here at the CGTN studios. If you'd like to watch the full-length, full-frame program, you can find it on CGTN Now via Apple TV. I'm Mike Walter. Thanks for listening.